The clock tower struck noon with a heavy clang that echoed down the sun-baked street. Dust lifted in lazy swirls as the town seemed to hold its breath. Men leaned against railings, women adjusted their bonnets, and children paused their games, all eyes turning toward the fresh sheet of paper nailed to the post outside the general store. It was a ranch cook notice, simple, short, written in the rancher's neat but hurried hand. A job posting. A chance for work. A chance for survival. In a town like this, where reputations were louder than sermons and everyone knew the price of everyone else's dignity, that notice was more than an invitation. It was a test. Most people glanced at it, then turned away. The ranch was no place for the faint-hearted. The work was hard, the pay modest, and the expectations brutal. Still, the fact that the notice went up at noon, when the whole town gathered, meant it was more than help he was looking for. The rancher was sending a message. He would choose publicly, and he wanted everyone to see who dared step forward. And then, through the stillness, came the sound of footsteps. Slow at first, then steadier, firmer. A woman appeared at the far end of the street. Her dress was plain, faded from too many washings. Her shawl, once bright, was now the color of ash. At her side walked two children, one tugging nervously at her sleeve, the other carrying a small, battered satchel that had seen better years. She was a widow. Everyone knew it. They knew how she struggled, how her children sometimes went to bed hungry. They knew the whispers that followed her in church pews and market stalls, whispers that called her both proud and desperate, stubborn and broken. And now, those whispers grew sharper, slicing through the tense silence as she took each step closer to the notice. "What is she thinking?" one woman hissed. "She can barely feed her own. How will she cook for a ranch?" another scoffed. A man with a hat pulled low muttered, "She wants pity work, that's all." But she kept walking. Her eyes were fixed, not on the townsfolk, not on the rancher who stood at a distance with his arms folded across his chest, but on the paper that fluttered lightly in the dry wind. Her children clung tighter to her skirt, aware of the eyes boring into them, but she didn't falter. The rancher narrowed his gaze. He hadn't expected this. No one had. A job meant for hardened hands, for men who boasted of their skill with cattle and campfires, was now being claimed by a woman who carried her family's survival in the curve of her shoulders. And in that moment, the town revealed itself. Some sneered openly, glad to see someone risk humiliation. Others watched with something quieter, almost like hope, as if her courage reminded them of struggles they themselves had buried. The widow reached the post. She read the words slowly, her lips moving without sound. Then she straightened, lifted her chin, and pressed her hand against the notice as if claiming it, as if saying to every pair of watching eyes, "I am here. I am enough." Gasps broke the silence. One child tugged her hand tighter. The other looked up at her with eyes wide in admiration. She did not look back at the crowd. She did not look away. No one expected her to answer. What followed left the whole town divided. But the rancher's reaction wasn't the real surprise. The town's was. The rancher's need was no secret. His cattle had been thinning, his hands leaving one by one for better wages downriver. Long days of drought had scorched the land, and creditors had begun circling like vultures. By posting that notice in the center of town, he wasn't simply hiring a cook. He was clawing at survival, daring to show he still had fight left in him. But he also knew the stakes. Whoever stood beside him would become a reflection of his judgment, his strength, his pride. That's why the widow's steps toward the notice felt like thunder. To the crowd, she wasn't a candidate. She was a contradiction. A woman without a husband, children at her heels, daring to enter a space reserved for the hardened and the unbroken. In the unwritten laws of that town, widows carried shadows, not promise. They were seen as mouths to feed, not hands to build, burdens to be pitted, not partners in work. Murmurs spread as fast as wildfire. Some whispered with ridicule, others with indignation. She'll slow the ranch down. He needs strength, not sympathy. A few were harsher still, calling her boldness shameless, her effort doomed before it even began. Their words weren't just commentary, they were daggers, sharpened by a culture that measured worth by the weight of a man's shadow, not the light of a woman's resolve. Yet there she stood. By daring to reach for that notice, she defied every expectation laid at her feet. She was not begging for pity. She was not asking for charity. She was demanding recognition of her worth, her work, her will to survive. And that act, so simple, so human, landed like a challenge in the heart of every bystander. The rancher himself stood caught in the balance. He needed help, yes, but the pressure of eyes upon him was heavier than any drought. If he accepted her, he risked becoming the subject of ridicule. A man so desperate he turned to a widow where no real ranch hand would come. If he refused, he would prove the crowd right, that dignity could be stripped from a woman with nothing more than a shake of the head. Every second stretched long, and every whisper rose louder. The widow kept her hand against the notice, her children at her side, as if daring the rancher to meet her gaze, daring the town to measure her against its cruel scales. The street had turned into a courtroom, and the jury was everyone she had ever known. For the audience watching this unfold, the tension was raw, almost unbearable. You couldn't help but feel protective of her, standing so small yet so unyielding against a sea of disapproval. She was carrying not just her children's future, but the weight of every unspoken rule that had kept women like her in the shadows. And by standing there, she shattered silence with nothing more than her presence. The risk was staggering. A man could walk away from rejection with a laugh. For her, rejection meant something far more brutal. Humiliation in broad daylight, her children watching, her neighbors whispering. Her courage turned into fuel for gossip. Because what she risked with that walk wasn't just rejection, it was humiliation on the biggest stage the town had. If courage could silence a town, bitterness could just as quickly rouse it again. Whispers grew into murmurs, and murmurs into voices sharpening like knives. The widow had stepped forward, but now the villains of the story began to gather in force, cloaking themselves in righteousness even as they prepared to wound. The first and loudest were the gossiping townsfolk, the women who never missed a Sunday hat, the men who never missed a drink at the saloon. They thrived on tales of other people's shame. To them, the widow was not a mother striving to feed her children, but an easy story to pass along like coins exchanged in a game. They spoke of her as reckless, as pitiful, as a woman blind to her own limitations. One sneered that she wanted more than wages, that perhaps she sought the rancher himself. Another muttered she was selfish to drag her children into humiliation, as though hunger behind closed doors was somehow more dignified than risking public rejection. Their cruelty was not loud, but constant, like the drone of insects around a wound. Then there was the preacher. His voice carried farther than gossip ever could, draped in the authority of Scripture and the weight of a pulpit. He was known to thunder about virtue, about the sanctity of family, about women knowing their place. And yet, when it came to this widow, his sermons bent conveniently into condemnation. From his lips came the poison that she should remain quiet, that her place was to lean on the charity of the church, not to stand in the marketplace and claim honest work. He spoke of humility while practicing humiliation. He spoke of God's mercy while denying mercy to her. The contradiction was plain, but cloaked in holy words, it carried a sting sharper than any insult muttered in the crowd. And behind them all, lurking like a shadow with real power, stood the wealthy ranch family. Their land stretched wider than the horizon, their cattle herds uncountable. To them, the widow was not simply beneath consideration. She was a threat to the order they maintained. If one poor woman could claim a place of dignity, if she could stand toe-to-toe with men and win respect, what would stop others from doing the same? Their arrogance was not in laughter or sermon, but in cold calculation. They whispered to the rancher himself, warning him that his choice would stain his reputation, that no serious man would ally himself with a woman so far below station. Their exclusion was deliberate, designed to keep the walls of power intact, to remind everyone who belonged inside and who would forever remain outside. What bound these antagonists together was not truth, but hypocrisy. They cloaked themselves in morality, tradition, and respectability, yet every word revealed fear that their grip on the town's order might loosen. They pretended to defend decency, but what they defended was pride. They condemned the widow not for weakness, but for daring to show strength where they insisted there should be none. Their chorus rose, their words circling like buzzards, preparing to swoop. The gossipers sharpened their stories, eager to spread them at supper tables and church steps. The preacher rehearsed his coming sermon, polishing his condemnation until it gleamed. The wealthy family gathered allies, whispering promises and threats in the same breath. Together, they built an invisible gallows, hoping to hang her dignity on it before she could even finish a plea. And the widow? She stood with her children, unaware of the plots forming, yet unflinching. The villains mistook her silence for weakness. They mistook her calm for ignorance. They mistook her struggle for defeat already written. But they had forgotten something essential. Desperation has a way of forging strength, and love has a way of sharpening the tongue into steel. The stage was set. Their arrogance grew louder, their gatekeeping bolder. They were ready to strike, to ensure she knew her place, to make an example of her courage so that no one else would dare. And yet, while they sharpened their words, they never expected what she carried inside her. Before she was the woman standing at the notice board with the weight of the town pressing down on her shoulders. She was a wife. Her husband had been a strong man, not wealthy, not powerful, but steady in the way that anchors steady a ship. He worked the land with calloused hands and quiet pride, always promising that no matter how thin the crops or how harsh the weather, he would keep food on the table. But fate does not honor such promises. An accident in the fields. Some said it was a horse that threw him. Others whispered it was sickness that took him quick and without warning, left her standing alone, with 2 young children clinging to her skirts and no one to carry the load beside her. The day he was buried, the town gave its condolences, but condolences don't fill stomachs. Neighbors came with baskets of bread for a week, perhaps 2, and then their own troubles called them back. Soon, she was left to face the truth every widow comes to know. Kindness runs shallow, but hunger runs deep. Her nights were long and heavy. The little house echoed with silence where a man's voice used to be, and the cupboard shelves grew bare no matter how carefully she rationed. Some evenings, she told her children bedtime stories while her own stomach twisted empty, pretending cheer, so they might sleep without worry. Other nights, she tucked them into bed early, hoping the darkness would trick their bellies into quiet. Pride kept her from begging, but pride did not keep her from breaking bread into smaller and smaller pieces, so her children believed they had enough. School became a luxury they could not afford. Her son, barely tall enough to carry a bucket without spilling it, began taking odd jobs, fetching water, sweeping floors. Her daughter learned to stitch until her fingers blistered, patching old clothes into something wearable. Their small hands grew older faster than they should have, their childhood exchanged for survival. Each coin they earned was a coin the family desperately needed, but each coin also carried the price of lost innocence. And yet, through all of this, she did not collapse into bitterness. She did not shout at the heavens or curse the town that looked past her. Her strength was not loud but steady, like the flame of a candle that refuses to be snuffed out no matter how strong the wind blows. She prayed in the mornings, worked through the day, prayed again at night. Her faith was not naive. It was carved by suffering, tested by hunger, stretched thin but never broken. She told her children again and again, "We are not less than others. We are not shameful. We are worth the air we breathe." It was that quiet resilience that kept her walking forward when others might have crumbled. Dignity was her armor. She refused to let whispers decide who she was. If neighbors pitied her, she thanked them with a nod and carried on. If others mocked her, she lowered her eyes but held her spirit high. For her, survival was not only about food and shelter. It was about teaching her children that their worth was not dependent on charity, that their value was not defined by scorn. Every hardship etched strength into her bones. Every humiliation hardened her resolve. Every night spent staring at an empty cupboard reminded her why she could not stop. Her children's faces were her purpose, their futures her battlefield. She was not fighting for herself. She was fighting so they could have a chance at life larger than survival, a chance to dream beyond hunger and gossip. So when the notice went up at the general store, it wasn't just opportunity she saw. It was a doorway. Others saw ink on paper. She saw salvation. She knew the town would laugh, that voices would rise against her. But she also knew she had stood against far worse than whispers. She had stared into nights darker than the judgment of men and endured. She had faced days when despair clawed at her, and still she rose to cook what little she had. Still she pressed on. Her walk across the street that noon was not a gamble. It was the culmination of years of sacrifice and silence. Her children deserved more than patched clothes and empty cupboards. They deserved to see their mother fight for them, not shrink before the world's cruelty. That notice was not just about wages. It was about dignity, about reclaiming the right to be seen as strong, capable, and worthy. And so, with each step, she carried not only her own courage, but the silent prayers of every woman who had been overlooked, every widow who had been dismissed, every mother who had been told she was less. She became their voice, though she spoke not a word. The town thought they were watching a desperate woman overreach. They didn't see the years of struggle behind her steady eyes. They didn't see the fire built from countless nights of want. They didn't see that the frail figure in a faded dress was not weakness, but endurance personified. And that history is exactly what made her ready for the storm about to come. The silence that followed was sharp enough to hear the dust stir at their feet. Every eye clung to the widow, waiting for her to stumble, to retreat, to wither under the weight of 100 hostile stares. Instead, she straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and let the hush stretch until it became unbearable. Her children looked up at her, wide-eyed, not yet knowing what she would say but sensing that it mattered. The rancher, arms still folded, fixed his stare on her face, trying to read whether this was stubborn pride or something deeper. When she spoke again, her voice carried steady and unflinching. "You say I don't belong here, that I am only a woman, only a widow, with mouths to feed. But I'll tell you this, those mouths you mock have kept me alive when grief and hunger nearly finished me. Those hands you dismiss have worked fields, hauled water, mended clothes, and tended wounds that none of you saw." A murmur rippled. Some frowned, some shifted uneasily. Her words were not defensive. They rang with quiet pride, each one refusing to bow. "I can build a fire out of damp wood when the rain won't stop. I can stretch beans and flour to feed more people than you think possible, because I have had to. I can mend a torn shirt with nothing but a needle bent from a nail. And I can nurse a sick child through the night, and still be up before dawn to make bread." Her hand rested lightly on her children's shoulders. "And as for these two, you call them burdens. I call them my strength. You see mouths to feed. I see hands to work, hearts to grow strong. They know more about labor and sacrifice than half the grown men standing here whispering against us." The smirk on one ranch hand's face faltered. The preacher, lips ready to form his next rebuke, hesitated. Even the wealthy ranch family, with their polished boots and polished contempt, shifted as if her words had touched a place they didn't want touched. She didn't let the silence return this time. She pressed forward, her words like hammer strikes, steady and certain. "You think me weak because I am alone. But I've had no one to split the wood, so I split it myself. No one to mend the fence, so I've mended it myself. No one to fetch water when the well ran dry, so I walked miles with buckets until my arm's knee gave way. If that's weakness, then I'll carry it proudly." Her voice lifted, stronger now, almost fierce. "If you believe a woman cannot feed men who work a ranch, then you've forgotten who raised you, who cooked your meals, who washed your shirts when you were still boys. You've forgotten the strength of your own mothers. Shame on you for mocking the very hands that made you." Her hand rested lightly on her children's shoulders because it wasn't just the words that turned the tide. It was what the rancher did next that left everyone stunned. The rancher's silence stretched until it felt like the whole town was holding its breath. Then, without ceremony, without apology, he took a single step forward. His boots hit the porch wood with a thud that seemed to break the spell. "I'll hire her," he said. Clear, firm, final. The words rang across the square like a bell, louder than the clock tower at noon, louder than the laughter that had tried to drown her. In one breath, he had defied the whispering wives, the scoffing hands, the preacher with his thunderless sermons, and even the wealthy ranch family that thought their judgment could steer the town. Gasps cut through the crowd. Some stood frozen, mouths parted as if they hadn't heard right. Others shook their heads, muttering about scandal and foolishness. But there it was, plain as the paper nailed to the post. The rancher had chosen, and he had chosen her. If this moment were to happen in another time, the hashtags would have spread like wildfire. #widow strong, #hands to work, hearts to grow, #dignity over pride. In a matter of hours, clips of her speech would circle the world, replayed, remixed, captioned with words like courage and truth. Strangers would watch her stand tall and feel themselves stand taller too. Supporters would post her words with fire emojis and bold headlines. She faced them all, and she didn't flinch. Even in the dusty street of that small town, the same ripple began. Whispers turned to debates. Debates turned to reckonings. Young women, standing behind their fathers, glanced at the widow with wide eyes, seeing possibility where there had been only fear. Other widows, faces lined by grief and hunger, felt a tremor in their chest, as if their own silenced voices had been given air. Poor families, the ones the wealthy ranchers dismissed as leeches, saw her courage as proof that poverty was not shame. It was proof of survival, proof of strength. The villains, once so sure of themselves, scrambled now to keep their footing. The preacher, red-faced, tried to speak louder, quoting verses about order, about obedience, but his words fell hollow. For every verse he thundered, there was a quiet truth echoing louder. The wealthy ranch family drew together, lips pressed tight, whispering that the rancher had doomed himself by choosing charity over sense. Yet even they saw the shifting tide. People they counted as loyal now seemed restless, uncertain, stirred by the widow's calm defiance. The gossiping wives found their tongues faltering. They had mocked, they had sneered, but when the rancher gave her the job, their ridicule suddenly felt cheap. Some doubled down, whispering sharper insults to mask their unease, but others stole glances at the widow with something uncomfortably close to admiration. And the ranch hands who had laughed the loudest? Their smirk soured. For the first time, they looked small, grown men, exposed for trying to break a woman who had already endured more hardship than they could imagine. A few kicked at the dust, muttering excuses. Others simply turned away, unable to meet her eyes. The ripple moved outward, changing the air itself. It was no longer just about a job on one ranch. It had become a battle line between those who clung to arrogance and those who saw dignity in struggle, pride in resilience. The widow did not gloat. She did not smile in triumph. She simply inclined her head, steady as ever, as if the rancher's words had not granted her dignity, but merely recognized what she had carried all along. And in that stillness, the town shifted. Some hated it. Some feared it. But many, far more than anyone would admit, felt the ground beneath them tilt, as though a new future had cracked open. 4 days after, it became the story told over supper tables and whispered in store aisles. Some said the rancher had been reckless. Others swore he had been brave. But no matter the telling, the widow's words lingered. You see mouths to feed. I see hands to work, hearts to grow strong. Those words, repeated, retold, reshared, began to take on a life of their own. A rallying cry, a reminder, a spark that would not be put out. The villains still schemed. They would not surrender so easily. But for the first time, they were not laughing. And yet, the most powerful ripple wasn't in the town at all. It was in the eyes of her children. As the crowd broke apart, as whispers scattered down side streets and the last echoes of protest faded, it was not the rancher or the townsfolk who spoke first. It was a child's voice, small but clear, tugging gently at the hem of the widow's dress. "Mama," he said, his eyes bright with something stronger than relief, "they listen to you." The words struck deeper than any cheer. For in that moment, she saw it, the pride dawning in her children's faces, the kind that no sermon or scorn could erase. They had not just survived humiliation. They had watched their mother stand, unshaken, against the weight of a town, and win not by force, not by pleading, but by the truth of her own worth. The rancher, too, had changed in that instant. People would remember him for hiring her, but those who watched closely saw something else. The rare courage it took for a man to cast aside gossip, to choose dignity over approval. His decision was not just about filling a kitchen. It was about recognizing that strength often wears the face of those overlooked, that wisdom sometimes speaks in a voice the powerful dismiss until it can no longer be ignored. The lesson lingered like the dust settling after a storm. The preacher's disapproval meant little now. The wealthy family's sneers looked smaller in hindsight. What mattered was a clarity that had risen from the widow's words. Hard work, truth, and courage outshine arrogance and hypocrisy every time. In every corner of that town, the story took on its own retelling. Some spoke of the rancher's defiance, others of the widow's boldness. But in every telling, the heart of it remained a dignity standing taller than pride, honesty cutting deeper than mockery, resilience shining brighter than wealth. And for her children, it became more than a story. It became inheritance, not of land or gold, but of something greater, the unshakable knowledge that their mother had faced a wall of ridicule and turned it into a platform of strength. That lesson would outlast hunger, outlast hardship, outlast the cruelty of those who would try again to silence them. The widow, walking home with her children at her side, did not carry herself as someone who had won a battle. She carried herself as someone who had revealed the truth that had always been there. The truth that worth is not handed down by the wealthy, or measured by gossip, or diminished by loss. Worth is proven in the quiet endurance of those who refuse to break. And as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in fire and ash, it seemed to whisper the same message across the fields, that dignity is not fragile, that it cannot be stolen by laughter or crushed by shame. It is the real inheritance, the lasting gift passed from parent to child, from generation to generation. For in every era, dignity is the true wealth. And in every age, it is the only inheritance that matters. At noon, a notice was nailed to a post, and the town expected just another day. No one believed the answer would come from a widow with children at her side. No one believed her voice would cut through laughter and shame, or that her dignity would bend the course of a ranch, and perhaps a community. But that is exactly what happened. She answered when others would have stayed silent. She stood when the world told her to bow. And in doing so, she showed that even in the harshest places, courage can strike like lightning, dignity can blaze brighter than ridicule, and truth can silence even the loudest mockery. Her story is not just about a cook hired at noon. It is about the power of standing tall when the world expects you to shrink. It is about every moment in history when ordinary people carried extraordinary strength, not for applause, not for recognition, but for survival, for justice, for the future of their children. And it is a reminder for us now, that in our own lives, in our own towns, in our own debates and divisions, courage still matters. Truth still matters. Dignity still matters. So if this story struck you, if you felt even a flicker of pride for her stand, don't keep it to yourself. Share it. Pass it forward. Let it remind someone else of what they carry inside them. Subscribe to hear more stories where dignity defies arrogance, where truth wins out, where hope lives on. And above all, stand with those who stand with dignity. Because one widow answered at noon, and the world is still listening.